In the early morning wind sweeping across the granite facade of the Detroit Central Library, an elderly black man sat motionless, cloaked in a threadbare overcoat stitched with faded unit patches. His name was Levi Stanton, and for 3 hours he had not moved, clutching a dog-eared volume of W.E.B. Du Bois. He wasn't panhandling. He wasn't shouting. He was reading, still as a monument, until a police cruiser pulled up. "You can't be here, sir," came the command. Levi looked up, eyes weary but composed. "I'm not here to cause trouble." But procedure took precedence. He was arrested, for loitering, for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. At the station, the booking officer skimmed his file, squinting at the ID, no fixed address, multiple prior warnings for trespassing, mostly libraries, transit stations, hospital lobbies. Not violent. Not intoxicated. Just, present. A soft-spoken presence in a loud world. One officer, curious, flipped through the personal effects, a torn envelope with Stanton, L, scribbled in military print, 2 faded photos of a younger Levi in fatigues, and a worn-down patch that barely read, U.S. Marines. He was held for 6 hours. No one posted bail. He didn't expect them to. That evening, the sun set behind the courthouse as he was quietly released without charge. As he stepped outside, the breeze caught the corner of his coat, revealing a stitched insignia that had once meant everything, now unnoticed, like the man who wore it. Levi paused at the sidewalk. He didn't turn left or right. Just stood still. The streets hummed around him. Somewhere far away, a memory stirred, but he kept walking, past the courthouse, past the station, back to the library steps. Tomorrow, he'd read again. Levi Stanton was born in 1949 in Sunflower County, Mississippi, a place where history hung thick in the air, and the weight of being black meant you inherited a struggle long before you understood it. His mother, Ruthie Mae Stanton, worked the fields from sunup to sundown for barely enough to feed her 3 children. His father, who had once registered black voters during the Freedom Summer, disappeared one night after a visit from the sheriff and 2 men in suits who didn't leave their names. Levi was 8. By 17, he had 2 options: pick cotton for the rest of his life or flee. Vietnam offered a third way, not better, but different. A recruiter came to the high school gymnasium promising paychecks, travel, and a uniform. Levi signed with a trembling hand. He was gone within the month. At Camp Pendleton, they tried to break him down and rebuild him. He let them tear him apart, but what they rebuilt was still himself, only quieter, more alert. A watcher. In 1968, he shipped out. His unit, 3rd Marine Division, saw action during Operation Dewey Canyon in the A Shau Valley. Mud, fire, screaming air. Levi never talked about those first weeks. But his CO wrote that Levi moved like smoke, always at the front, always last to sleep. He kept watch when others collapsed. Carried extra water for those too shell-shocked to drink. One Marine swore Levi pulled him out from under a downed chopper under fire. No commendation followed. No one filed the report. Too many missions, too much confusion, too many dead. Then came Laos. The mission didn't officially happen. Cross-border. Extraction under cover of night. Intel failure. A full squad pinned down with radio silence and 2 wounded. Levi was point man that night. They'd trained for jungle terrain, but no training prepared them for what went wrong. When their lieutenant, Samuel Norrell, caught shrapnel to the spine, it was Levi who crawled through enemy fire, wrapped a tourniquet with his own shirt, and slung the man over his shoulders. For 4 hours, he moved through razor grass and rising fog, flanked by men too afraid to speak. He didn't sleep for 2 days after. The debrief never happened. The mission file was sealed, classified under covert operations. No medals were issued. Levi didn't care, then. "We came back," he once said. "That's what mattered." But back home, it was a different war. He arrived in Oakland to protesters shouting, "Baby killer," and a country that met him not with honor but avoidance. He returned to Mississippi briefly, only to find the farm sold and his mother moved north. The VA claimed his discharge papers were incomplete. His medical file, detailing head trauma and shrapnel, was missing pages. A clerical error, they said. Then silence. Again. In New York, he worked loading docks. In Chicago, he cleaned rail cars. In Cleveland, he did day labor until a fall left him with a broken rib and no insurance. Years passed. The pain in his back, his knees, his hands, constant reminders. He stopped trying to correct the system after the 5th rejection letter. Insufficient verification of service, one read. He had his tags, but without the right forms, the VA said, he was just another claimant. In one rusted shoebox, Levi kept what remained, a snapshot of his platoon in front of a sandbagged outpost, a letter from his friend Duke who died in Quang Tri, and a half-burnt pocket Bible. When nights grew cold, he'd unfold them like a map to the past. He memorized the names. Told their stories to no one but himself. Detroit called him in the early 90s. He came chasing the echo of family, a cousin who used to send letters. But the cousin had passed, 2 years before Levi arrived. Still, the city felt familiar. The smokestacks, the brick alleys, the voices on the street. There were other men like him. Not many, but enough to feel less alone. Some wore their medals on old jackets. Others wore their silence. He lived out of shelters, sometimes in his car until it broke down and was towed. A social worker at one shelter tried to help him refile his benefits, but the office lost the request. When he went in person, a clerk told him they couldn't find his record. "Maybe you served under another name," she said. He left without answering. But Levi didn't vanish. Not quite. Each morning, no matter the season, he walked the 3 miles to the Detroit Central Library. It became his sanctuary. He'd read Du Bois, Baldwin, Ellison. Sometimes a young student would hand him a sandwich. Other times, security would warn him to keep moving. But the library steps became his post, his own kind of sentry duty. The only thing left to guard was memory. One December morning, after a brutal snowstorm, a librarian named Tony found Levi asleep outside, a copy of The Souls of Black Folk open beside him. Tony let him in. For an hour, Levi sat at the window with a paper cup of coffee, eyes scanning the people below. He didn't speak unless spoken to. When Tony asked what he liked to read, Levi answered simply, "Things that remember." Tony tried to contact veteran outreach programs. Some numbers were dead. Others offered to look into it. Nothing happened. Winter turned again. Levi stayed. The police came more often. Business owners nearby complained. He wasn't violent. He wasn't loud. But he made people uncomfortable in the way only the forgotten can. He didn't beg. He just showed up. Every morning. Every day. Reading the same book. Sitting with the past. Then one spring morning, a call came in to the precinct. A suspicious man on library steps. Non-compliant. Potential vagrant. A cruiser was dispatched. They approached. Levi didn't run. He didn't argue. When asked his name, he gave it, Levi Stanton. The officer paused, typed it in. Nothing came up. Back seat of the cruiser. Booking desk. One more night behind bars. He said nothing. Only watched the clock on the wall. And that name, Stanton, floated quietly into the system, waiting to be noticed. To be remembered. Detroit had seen better days. Levi Stanton arrived as a shadow, drifting into the city like so many forgotten veterans. He didn't announce himself. He didn't ask for help. He just appeared, quiet, composed, worn. The war hadn't taken his life, but it had taken everything around it. Whatever he had returned with, documents, medals, identity, was gone, scattered across decades of lost records and in different offices. He had tried. Early on, he waited in long lines at the VA downtown, sometimes in full dress uniform, pressed clean. When asked for discharge papers, he produced the photocopies he had managed to keep. They were old, smudged, partially illegible. A clerk skimmed them, tapped keys, frowned. "You're not in our system," she said. "Service records are incomplete." When he tried to explain the Black Ops, the missions in Laos, the name Norel, she just shook her head. There was no place in the system for stories that couldn't be confirmed. A missing file was as good as a lie. With no formal acknowledgement of injuries or honorable discharge, Levi couldn't qualify for veterans housing or long-term care. He applied anyway. Reapplied. Wrote appeals. No one responded. Eventually, he stopped trying. He learned to carry rejection quietly, as another weight among many. By the late 1990s, he was living in and out of abandoned buildings, couch surfing when he could, making do with day labor. Construction sites. Kitchen prep. Loading docks. He was reliable, but invisible. No ID. No bank account. He was paid in cash, rarely thanked. The world no longer saw a Marine, it saw a drifter, another black man in a rusting city filled with them. And then, Detroit's collapse accelerated. Factories closed. Neighborhoods emptied. Support services thinned. Levi remained, anchored not by roots but by the fact that he had nowhere else to go. He found a rhythm, sleep in shelters when available, churches when desperate, and the library steps when the weather allowed. He wasn't homeless in the way people imagine. He was houseless, sure. But not without dignity. He woke early, cleaned himself in restroom sinks, shaved with dull razors, ironed his shirt between books. The library became his sanctuary. Not because it was warm, but because it remembered things. And Levi was a man shaped by memory. Each day, he returned to the same corner with the same dog-eared volume, W.E.B. Du Bois' The Souls of Black Folk. Inside were underlined passages, notes in the margins, and dates tracking the years he'd reread it. It was the only possession he never lost. He guarded it like a relic, like proof of mind, of presence, of purpose. People passed him every day. Students. Lawyers. Tourists. Some ignored him. Some nodded. Some assumed he was just another city fixture, like the lion statues out front. The library staff tolerated him, quietly protective. He was the reader, a fixture whose silence earned him unofficial allowance. He asked for nothing. Not money. Not food. Only space. Over time, his clothing grew more patched. His overcoat bore remnants of his unit, 3rd Marine Division, Operation Dewey Canyon, though few would recognize the faded stitching. He still polished his boots with a scrap of old flannel. Inside the coat's pocket were slips of paper, a rejection letter from the VA, a discharge form missing a signature, and a letter he never mailed addressed simply, Department of the Navy, Washington, D.C. The city saw him, but not really. Social workers passed by. Outreach teams asked his name, but didn't write it down. The ones who tried to help always left eventually. Budgets dried up. Programs ended. But Levi remained. Constant. Unchanging. He had become, in a way, the library's quiet conscience. And then came the night of the deep freeze. It was February. Temperatures dropped below zero. The shelter on Cass Avenue had no beds left. Levi wrapped himself in plastic and newspapers and curled into the alcove by the library's eastern column. He stayed awake as long as he could, counting breaths. Sometime after midnight, his body gave in. A janitor found him the next morning. Blue lips. Shivering. Barely able to speak. He was taken by ambulance to Henry Ford Hospital. The intake form listed him as male, approximate 70s, possible veteran. No insurance. No next of kin. No ID beyond his weathered dog tags. He was treated for hypothermia and released within 2 days, still unclaimed. A social worker wrote down a number to call for housing options, then moved on. Levi tore the paper in half and tucked it into his coat pocket. He never called. Back at the library, he resumed his routine. A little slower. A little more hunched. But still present. One morning, a librarian named Tony brought him a tea, left it beside him without a word. The next day, someone dropped off wool gloves. A teenager handed him a granola bar. People began to see him, not clearly, not fully, but with faint recognition. Yet no one asked about the book. No one asked what it meant, or why he read it every day, or why page 123 was marked with a torn playing card. No one asked who he was before Detroit, before the war, before the frost. Levi never offered. The story was too long. Too fragmented. Too unverifiable. He had become one of many whose history had been swallowed. His name, once spoken in battlefield radio calls and whispered in the dark of combat, now lived only in the margins of a forgotten book. Then one afternoon, without ceremony, a city police officer approached him outside the library. "Standard procedure," they said. "You can't stay here anymore." He didn't argue. He stood slowly, picked up his book, and nodded. "I understand." He was arrested for loitering. Fingerprinted. Processed. His name entered a system that hadn't seen him in decades. Levi Stanton. It showed up on a court docket the next week. A minor charge. A standard public defender assigned. One of hundreds of cases. But that name, those 2 words, caught the eye of someone in the public defender's office. Someone who paused. Who stared. Someone who had heard the name before. A granddaughter. A story. A memory. A promise. Maya Norrell never believed in coincidence. As a public defender in a city overflowing with broken systems and lost stories, she'd learned early that behind most arrests lay a history no intake form could capture. But when she saw the name Levi Stanton listed on the docket for misdemeanor loitering, she felt something rare, a shift in gravity. She stared at the file. Age, 75. Location of arrest, Detroit Central Library. Charge, loitering, non-compliant. He had no prior record, no ID on file. Her eyes narrowed. The name echoed like a bell in a cathedral. She remembered being 16, sitting on the porch beside her grandfather, Samuel Norrell. A Marine colonel, Silver Star recipient, and a man who carried war like a scar beneath the skin. That night, as cicadas buzzed and the Mississippi heat lingered, she had asked him what war took from him. Samuel didn't answer immediately. He looked out into the trees and said softly, "I once bled out in Laos. Thought it was the end. Then a man picked me up and carried me through fire." He paused. Stanton. That was his name. Levi Stanton. It was the only time he spoke of that day. Years later, when Samuel passed, Maya found a shoebox tucked beneath his bed. Inside were medals, folded letters, and an old cassette. She'd kept it unopened until law school nearly broke her. One sleepless night, she played it. Her grandfather's voice filled the room. "I lived because Levi carried me like I was his own. I owed him everything. Never saw him again. The mission disappeared, and so did he." Now, staring at the arrest record, Maya's throat tightened. She requested the case. No one questioned her, her record of tireless advocacy spoke for itself. But she said nothing about her reason. Not yet. When the hearing convened, she entered the courtroom just as Stanton was brought in. Thin, weary, clutching a book like it anchored him to earth. Maya's breath caught. Time had worn his body, but not his presence. She approached the bench. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "I request to represent the defendant." The judge squinted. "Miss Norrell, this is a minor infraction." "I understand," she replied. "But I believe there's more to this case than the charge." The judge granted a recess. Outside the courtroom, Maya introduced herself. "Mr. Stanton, I believe you knew my grandfather. Samuel Norrell. Laos, 1971. Levi didn't blink. His voice came slow. "Samuel Norrell. I carried him." Maya nodded. "He never forgot." Levi looked away. "They told me he died. Never heard from anyone again. Thought I'd imagined the whole thing." "You didn't," she said. "He lived. And he talked about you." She hesitated. "I have something he wanted you to hear." She returned home and found the cassette. Transferred to digital, her grandfather's voice rang through speakers. "If you ever find him, tell him I remembered. Tell him he was the bravest man I ever saw." Maya stayed up through the night digging. She requested declassified documents, scoured veteran archives, and eventually found what she'd hoped, an unprocessed Silver Star recommendation hidden in the digital vaults, never signed, never mailed, but official. It detailed Levi's actions in Laos, the rescue of 3 men under enemy fire, and the failure to process the award due to the classified nature of the mission. She brought it to court the next day, printed and bound. As Levi stood beside her once more, she handed the judge a sealed motion. "I'm not asking this court to erase a charge," she said. "I'm asking it to see the full measure of the man before you. A Marine. A rescuer. A forgotten hero." She pressed play on her grandfather's voice recording. The courtroom went still. "Stanton didn't carry me out of loyalty. He did it because it was right. Because he had more courage than I did that day." A murmur passed through the spectators. A veteran in the back wiped his eyes. Then, as if orchestrated by fate, the courtroom doors opened. A Marine colonel in full dress blues entered, flanked by 2 aides. He stepped forward. "Sergeant Levi Stanton," he said. "On behalf of the Department of the Navy, and in acknowledgement of recently uncovered documents, I am authorized to confer upon you the Silver Star for gallantry in action." Levi didn't speak. He couldn't. He accepted the medal with trembling hands. The courtroom rose as one. Not with thunderous applause, but in quiet, solemn respect. The judge removed his glasses. "Case dismissed," he said. "With regret that it was ever filed." Levi turned to Maya, unable to find words. She smiled softly. "He wanted to thank you. I'm just the messenger." As Levi walked out of court, sunlight hit the medal on his chest. For the first time in decades, the world looked at him and saw not a loiterer, not a vagrant, but a man who had carried history on his back. And someone had finally borne witness. The day after the courtroom moment that turned Levi Stanton from a forgotten man into a recognized hero, the city itself seemed to hesitate, as if unsure how to receive him. For Levi, the shift wasn't immediate. He didn't wake up feeling different. He still rose early. Still folded his worn coat over his arm like a flag. But when he stepped out of the temporary shelter he'd been offered overnight, something had changed. People paused. Not everyone. But a few. A security guard nodded. A woman on the bus offered her seat. At a diner on Cass Avenue, a waitress served him without the cautious glance he'd come to expect. "Saw you on TV," she said. "Thank you for your service." Levi didn't quite know what to say. He muttered a quiet, "You're welcome," and looked out the window. Meanwhile, Maya Norell had become a woman on a mission. The victory in court wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. She knew Levi's dignity wasn't restored with one medal. A silver star pinned decades late, however honorable, did not put food on the table or rewrite the record. So she called in favors. She spoke with her law firm's veterans advocacy contacts. She filed petitions with the Department of Veterans Affairs. She met with the city's Office of Housing and explained that a decorated Marine had been sleeping on steps and eating from soup lines. Within a week, Levi had been placed into dignified veteran housing just east of the Detroit River, a modest but clean studio apartment in a building where residents greeted each other by name and where a U.S. flag flew above the entrance. His room had a view of the water, and at night, the distant city lights flickered like some quiet salute. But Maya wasn't done. One late evening, she drove back to the courthouse archives. After 3 hours combing through intake records and property logs, she found an entry from years earlier. A pawn shop on Gresham had once received 2 Purple Hearts, both unverified, both turned in by a man matching Levi's description. No name was attached. They'd been melted for scrap. Maya felt rage swell. She returned to her office and made 2 calls, one to a veteran-owned metal restoration firm, the other to a contact in Washington who worked in records recovery. Days passed. Then, one morning, a package arrived for her, contents listed as recovered items, Valor Restoration. Inside were replicas of Levi's medals, 2 Purple Hearts and a Vietnam Service Medal, all restored to period-authentic condition. Alongside them was something even more sacred, a sealed letter. Samuel Norell's handwriting, faded but legible. Maya recognized it. Her grandfather had written many letters in life, but this one had never been sent. It was addressed to Sergeant Levi Stanton. She held it for a long time before driving across town. Levi answered his door with a quiet, "Ma'am," and stepped aside when he saw her. She placed the box on his table, then handed him the letter. "I found this," she said. "He wrote it after the war. It never got to you." Levi opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a single sheet, yellowed with time. "Levi. If this ever reaches you, I hope you're still walking the earth. You saved my life. More than that, you saved what kind of man I could be. They didn't recognize you. I know that. But I did. I always did. I'm sorry I couldn't change how things were. But I'll never forget how you carried me like I was your own brother. You were more than brave. You were right. Samuel." Levi stared at the paper for a long time. Then he folded it once, carefully, and placed it back in the envelope. "He was a good man," he said. "He remembered." "Yes," Maya said. "He remembered everything." Word of Levi's recognition spread. Local news picked up the story. A segment aired about the Forgotten Marine, showing footage from the courtroom and highlighting the Silver Star's long journey home. Veterans from across the state reached out. Some came to visit. Others sent letters. One woman, the daughter of a Marine from Levi's old unit, brought a photograph of them in Vietnam. In the faded image, 5 men stood shoulder to shoulder. Levi recognized them all. 3 had died in Laos. 1 was Samuel. The last was him, young, unburdened, unaware of what lay ahead. The story struck a chord. Donations began arriving, small, unasked-for gifts. A church sent groceries. A VFW chapter replaced his winter coat. But Levi remained reserved. He accepted kindness, not charity. He insisted on helping where he could, volunteering twice a week at a local literacy center, tutoring students in reading. A man should stay useful, he told Maya. Then came the call from City Hall. A committee had voted unanimously to commission a bench outside the Detroit Central Library, the place where Levi had once read quietly each morning, unnoticed by all but the wind and the pigeons. On the morning of the unveiling, dozens gathered. Veterans, students, city officials, and quiet strangers who'd read his story. Maya stood at the podium and spoke simply. This city once overlooked a hero. Now we honor him not with speeches, but with a place for others to sit and reflect, just like he did. Not to be noticed. Just to be present. The tarp was pulled back. The bench was bronze, smooth and unadorned except for a single inscription. In honor of Sergeant Levi Stanton. A man who carried more than his brothers. He carried a history that refused to forget. Levi sat down slowly, his hands resting on the cool metal. He didn't cry. He just closed his eyes. Each year after, on the date of the Laos mission, veterans and students gathered there. They brought flowers. Some read passages from W.E.B. Du Bois. Some brought boots or old medals. They came not to protest or perform, but to remember. To remind each other that service doesn't end with silence. And that sometimes, justice comes decades late, but comes just the same. And Levi, whether in presence or memory, sat among them all. A witness, at last, not to war, but to restoration. By the following spring, Levi Stanton had quietly become a name spoken in more and more places, at city council meetings, in classrooms, across veterans organizations in Detroit and beyond. But Levi himself remained unchanged. He still rose with the sun, still read his Du Bois volume every morning, though now he read it from his own modest living room, seated near the window that faced the slow, glistening drift of the Detroit River. He still carried himself with the kind of dignity no metal could create and no time could erase. But things had changed around him. The bench outside the Central Library had become something of a pilgrimage site. Maya Norell began bringing her law students there for reflection. Local veterans left challenge coins or unit patches at its base, like offerings. High school classes visited to talk about both military service and the responsibility of memory. A history teacher from Cass Tech had even launched a student oral history project on forgotten black veterans, naming it the Stanton Tapes. In time, the bench was never truly empty. Levi didn't care for attention. A bench is more than enough, he told Maya one afternoon, as they sat near the river. Let it be for others, too. Not just me. His voice was raspy but gentle. I just want peace now. Not noise. He found it, in small ways. Volunteers came to help him organize his papers, most of which had never been filed properly. One young VA employee helped him recover back pay. Another tracked down his long-lost discharge certificate. It had taken over 40 years and a courtroom moment to shake the system awake, but it was awake now. For Levi, this wasn't about compensation. It was about being visible. One day, he received a small, carefully wrapped package. Inside were 2 items, the original Silver Star recommendation typed by a field commander named Barnes, and a personal letter from the Commandant of the Marine Corps. The letter apologized formally for the oversight and acknowledged Stanton's heroism as an example to all who wear the uniform. Levi read it once, then tucked it behind his bookshelf. It's not the paper I needed, he said to himself. It's the truth. Maya checked in on him often. She brought coffee and updates. They talked about law, the system, the cost of silence. Sometimes, they didn't talk at all. They sat and listened to the water. One evening, Maya brought her young daughter to meet him. The girl stared up at Levi and asked, "Are you the man from the statue?" Levi laughed softly. "I'm not a statue, sweetheart. I'm just a man who sat on a bench." "Well," the girl replied, "my teacher said you're brave." Levi looked at Maya, his eyes shining a little. "I'm just tired," he said. "But that's enough now." In the fall, a non-profit group created a scholarship in his name, the Levi Stanton Scholarship for Undocumented Veterans. Funded by private donors, it provided legal support, documentation help, and pathways to housing for those who had served and then slipped through the cracks. "If one more soldier doesn't have to sit where I sat," Levi said at the announcement ceremony, "then we've already done something good." He gave no long speeches. No demands. Just that quiet sentence, and a nod. One December afternoon, Maya arrived with a surprise. She handed Levi a small black case. Inside were dog tags. His. "I found them," she said. "In a private estate sale. No one knew what they were. But I recognized your serial number from the records." Levi turned the metal tags over in his hands. "I thought they were gone." "You were never gone," Maya replied. "Just misfiled by history." A week later, as the first snow fell, a small ceremony was held outside the library. The city unveiled a bronze plaque beside the bench, inscribed with a fuller account of Levi's story, his rescue of fellow Marines, the years of invisibility, the long road to recognition. The mayor read the final line aloud. "To be seen is to be healed. This bench is for all who carried burdens no one else could see." Levi didn't attend that ceremony. He said he wanted the story to live on its own. Instead, he spent that day in his room, rereading letters from Samuel, polishing his medals, and listening to Billie Holiday on vinyl. "Let them speak my name," he whispered, "but let them speak for others, too." In the months that followed, Levi's health declined. Decades of untreated wounds, physical and otherwise, took their toll. He remained lucid, determined, and calm. He told Maya once, during a visit, "I don't want to be remembered just for a war. I want to be remembered for surviving it, and for helping others after." One morning, the nurse on duty entered his room and found him seated near the window, eyes closed, book on his lap. He had passed quietly in his sleep, the river catching early sunlight just beyond the glass. The news spread gently but quickly. Maya held a small memorial in the reading room of the Central Library. No pomp. No uniforms. Just stories. Veterans shared memories of how they'd met Levi on the bench and how he'd listened more than he spoke. A young man from the Literacy Center recited a poem Levi had helped him write. Maya read a letter, her grandfather's words, one last time. Levi was buried at Fort Custer National Cemetery with full honors. The Marine colonel who once stepped into the courtroom came to present the flag to Maya. "He saved lives, changed lives, and never asked for anything but to be heard," he said. Maya later walked alone to the bench. A new line had been added beneath the original inscription. "Rest well, Sergeant Stanton. Your watch is over." Each year, on the anniversary of his Laos rescue, the community gathers not just to mourn, but to act. They bring food for shelters. They file claims for other forgotten veterans. They speak names lost in files and overlooked by time. And in that way, Levi Stanton lives on, not in granite or bronze, but in the quiet duty of those who finally understood what he stood for. Not charity. Not apology. But presence. And truth. Presence remembered.